Good morning, everyone. Looks like it's 5 after. I think we've got everybody signed in. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this morning. Still morning, just barely. And this is 5 Keys to Disaster Recovery Nirvana. Who am I? I am Ned Bellavance. I am the Director of Cloud Solutions and Hybrid IT here at Anexinet. In addition to that, I am a Microsoft MVP in cloud and data center management, and Microsoft Azure just got awarded that, or got that added in the past month. So that was pretty exciting. And I also run 2 podcasts for Anexinet, if you haven't already heard them. First one is called Anexipod, and that is a podcast where I talk to thought leaders and people in the tech field about new and exciting technologies. And the other one is Buffer Overflow. It's a weekly tech news podcast where I'm joined by some of my colleagues here at Anexinet to talk about what's interesting and cool in the IT news sphere. Speaking of Anexinet, who has Anexinet? So we have an overarching vision, and that vision is that everyone deserves a great digital experience. And when we talk about everyone, we're not just talking about your end users or the clients that are consuming services you give. We're actually also talking about those people, like your employees or internal users. They all deserve a great digital experience, and there's a lot of components to the great digital experience. And so we understand that it's not just that front end UI; it's all the components that sit behind it, including modern infrastructure, analytics, um, and the end user compute area of things. There's a lot that goes into delivering that great digital experience, and it's something that we aspire to as a company. But you're here to hear about disaster recovery and the big 5 keys. So let's get down into it. All right. So the first key for that, we think of when we're thinking of disaster recovery is that you have to put business first. And the reason that I say that is DR is often thought of as a technology first solution. And that really obscures the underlying truth, which is it's about enabling your business to continue to run in the event of a disaster or incident. If your business can't function, you can't bring in revenue or whatever your company metric is, and all the technology in the world isn't going to help if the business can't get work done. So any disaster recovery plan necessarily has to be business first. And how does the business accomplish what they need to do? Most of the time, that's through some type of application. And so we also want to take an application centric view of things. So rather than starting with the bottom layer, which is, storage replication or something like that, instead, we need to start at the very top layer of things where the applications exist and work our way down in view of supporting those applications and making sure that the business side of the house is able to do what they need to do. Now, another key thing that we think is vital to disaster recovery being successful is embracing automation. Automation builds a level of consistency and repeatability that is otherwise very difficult to achieve if you've got a lot of manual processes. Automation also factors into the need for consistent practice of your disaster recovery plan. If you're only going to do it once a year, chances are it's going to be a painful experience, and everything's going to change so drastically that your plan is woefully out of date. And without doing consistent and constant practice of DR, in the event of a real incident, your recovery time is going to be well, not great, let's say. And then finally, we believe in leveraging the cloud for disaster recovery. There are some things that the cloud easily enables for companies of all size to use in order to have a more robust disaster recovery plan. And so I'll dive into those a little bit as well. But first, I'd like to start with, well, it's not a direct quote from someone, but this is probably something that you've heard someone say, and that's all companies are now technology companies. And you might be nodding your head a little bit. Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. We're a technology company, and I believe that's wrong. I think that's the wrong approach to take when it comes to technologies, and it's the wrong perspective or lens to view your organization through. That's not to say that there aren't any companies that are technology companies, but certainly by no means are all companies technology companies. And in order to illustrate that a little bit, I want to bring up an example. Scott D. Lowe from Actual Tech Media posted about this, and I think it's a great example. So I want you to think of Domino's Pizza. And I know we all have varied opinions about the pizza itself, but that aside, when you think of Domino's Pizza, about 5 years ago, they were really struggling as an organization. Their stock was tanking, people weren't buying. Um, and they used technology as an enabler to regrow their business. Now, they did a lot of other things. They allegedly improved the quality of their pizza. I can't speak from personal experience necessarily, but word on the street is that their pizza has, in fact, gotten better, and some people are very loyal adherents to that. But in the technology community, they became the darlings of embracing the modern digital experience and giving millennials a new way to interact with pizza companies, which all of that was true. But if we want to get down to a fundamental question here about Domino's, what would happen if Domino's today stopped making pizzas and focused on technology? There's a really high probability that they would quickly go out of business because at the end of the day, Domino's core business proposition is that they deliver somewhat edible pizzas to your door in a reasonable amount of time. And if they stop doing that, they're no longer going to have a business. So while technology is important to the business, it's not the sole reason they exist. I like to think of technology as an enabler. It's a tool that allows Domino's to grow and be better as a business. So when we're looking at disaster recovery, we have to use the same lens. Let's look at what's most important to the business and make sure that our technology and our disaster recovery plan is an enabler that the business can use to be better at doing business. And that's because downtime has significant costs to a company. So we looked at a survey from Zeta.net, and this was their state of disaster recovery from 2016. Of the companies they surveyed, more than 54% had an event where they were down for at least 8 hours in the past 5 years. Being down for 8 hours, if you can imagine, is obviously pretty painful. And it also means that the business can't transact the business they need to do to bring in revenue or complete orders or whatever the mechanism is. And so based off of that, 67% of the businesses said that they would lose $20,000 or more every day of downtime. In fact, 27% said they would lose more than $100,000 a day. Now, I think for those of us that participated in Amazon Prime Day last week, you know that Amazon had a little trouble fulfilling orders at the early hours of Prime Day. There was a bottleneck that was unforeseen, and they did eventually rectify it, but they lost not hundreds of thousands of dollars, but millions of dollars in potential revenue from lost sales. Not that everybody has Amazon's problems, but it certainly illustrates the point that disaster recovery isn't always a full disaster. It can be an incident that causes you, partial outage or an issue like that. And that has real financial consequences to the business. So the thing that sits behind the business are obviously business applications. And so we like to look at disaster recovery through the lens of those business applications. Now, of course, business applications are how the users are interacting with the business, but there are shared services in this layer cake of businesses, business applications, and that includes things like end user computing. How are people accessing that business application? Identity access management. How are they authenticating, and how are they determining what level of access should they have? And the back-end collaboration, whether that's a Slack channel or sending email through Exchange, or chat through some sort of instant messenger like Skype. All of those components are shared services that either augment the business application or required to access it. And then below that shared services layer, because Anexinet has an infrastructure background, well, we also understand that there is a whole bunch of other stuff down there amongst the private and public cloud that supports both the shared services and the business applications. Now, the common thread amongst all of these things is if you look at the far right, disaster recovery spans this entire nice little layer cake of technology. I kind of want cake now. But the entire stack is spanned by disaster recovery. And so, though we start with the application first approach, what needs to be in place for that application to run, there are a whole bunch of other components that need to be taken into account when you're developing a disaster recovery plan. And the next thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is RTO and RPO. And for those who might not be familiar with those terms, though I'm guessing a lot of you are, RTO refers to the recovery time objective. And so that is how long does it take you to recover and be back up and functional after an event? So sometimes the recovery time could be something like, we'll be back up in 4 hours. And that might be fine for an external facing website that's not used a whole lot. Other times the recovery time objective could be seconds. If you're an e-commerce site, you can't have more than a few seconds of downtime, or like Amazon, you start losing millions on the back end. RPOs is the recovery point objective, and that speaks to how much data am I comfortable with losing or potentially losing in the event that something goes down. And that could mean that you're comfortable with losing a decent amount of potential data, like a 15-minute or a 4-hour RPO says, I can recover up to 4 hours ago in terms of my backend data. Or you could have something that needs real-time synchronization because no data loss is acceptable. So all transactions are synchronized to some other site in real time using like array-based technology. Now, the thing that we discovered, we looked at a survey from Cloud Endure, and they said that 40% of organizations are capable of meeting their RTO and RPO consistently. Everybody else fails when they try to hit those RTO and RPO. Now, how can one improve hitting especially your recovery time objective? And so for that, our recommendation is to embrace automation. And why is that? So when you think about your disaster recovery plan, you might think of a run book that you have sitting up on a shelf somewhere that collects dust for 11 months out of the year. And then your 1 month, when you actually run the practice, you take it down and it's woefully out of date. And so your recovery process is likewise kind of out of date. Embracing automation allows you to create a set of consistent and repeatable processes that you can execute in disaster recovery that not only removes the human element of error from the recovery process, but it also speeds up the recovery process because these are automated tasks. No one's reading through the run book and then clicking next and looking at the run book and clicking next. That's obviously not a very efficient approach to disaster recovery. Now, ideally, in a perfect world, and we all know we don't live there, we would want disaster recovery to follow production in terms of automation. So although we are recommending that disaster recovery embrace automation at a larger scale, we'd also like production to embrace automation. And what's the benefit there from a disaster recovery perspective? The biggest one is that when you automate your production environment and deployments, you've already, as a bonus, automated your disaster recovery because the process that you're using to automate production is the same process that you can then flip over and use in disaster recovery, with a few tweaks depending on your DR environment. But if you have that template and that automation already in place, you're getting that consistent recovery process. And the even better news is that your process will always, for disaster recovery, is always going to be up to date because you're just following whatever's happening in production, as opposed to always trying to keep your DR plan up to date based off of a practice that you ran 6 months ago. It's very hard to keep that stuff up to date. The other thing that we found when we were looking at some of the different disaster recovery survey data out there is that people are the number one or number two, depending on the study, reason for outages and delayed recovery. And that's because, let's all admit it, people are fallible. We make mistakes. And even when we're very careful, those mistakes can really hurt us. And especially in the realm of high stress situations, if we think about disaster recovery for a second, an actual disaster where you're tasked with getting a system back up in a matter of minutes, that's a very high stress situation. And some people don't react very well to that and tend to make mistakes. And then those mistakes can compound and make that recovery process even longer than it was originally going to be. If you can embrace automation for the recovery of your the recovery of your environment, it takes that manual element out where people are freaking out. If they have that process to follow and it's well defined and it's automated, they can follow that as opposed to trying to walk through a manual run book where they could easily make a mistake that'll set you back, 15 minutes or a couple hours. I've even seen that happen. So embracing automation, kind of a good one. Another big key to keep in mind is running disaster recovery exercises. So based off of survey data from Forrester, it was determined by the companies they surveyed that 81% of companies run their DR drill once a year or less. So to put that in context of another sort of analogy, I'm a runner, and so I do run the occasional marathon, and I got to tell you, if someone asked me to not run for the entire year and then get off the couch once a year and go run 26.2 miles, I would look at them like they were crazy, like super crazy pants there. That's nonsense. You would never do that. I mean, yeah, you could try it, but you'd probably end up like this guy, not feeling too hot at the end. Yeah, you'd finish, but you've basically destroyed yourself. So obviously that's not a great approach to go with. So what can we do to improve upon the practice? And if we're following along with that analogy of the DR marathon, if I'm preparing for an actual marathon, some of the things that I do is, run multiple times a week, maybe have a long run on the weekend. You could take the same exact kind of approach with disaster recovery. Now, you don't have to do the full disaster recovery marathon once a month or once a quarter. You could break that into manageable chunks and say, we're just going to recover this application or recover this set of infrastructure. But the fact that you're practicing and iterating on that and getting better at it means that you're building confidence in your people. They understand and they feel confident about their ability to recover an environment appropriately. You're also building in that sort of muscle memory of how to do it so that when that event happens and you're in a high stress situation, muscle memory kicks in and you're able to perform in the way that you need to recover your environment. And you're also going to reduce the amount of time it takes to do something. I know from experience, if you run consistently in your training plan up to the marathon, you're going to run your marathon faster than if you just tried to hop off the couch and do it. So obviously, practicing your DR is huge. The last point to make is that, or last key, I should say, is leveraging the cloud. Now, just to provide a little context data, we looked at a report, the State of IT report from Spiceworks last year, and they surveyed a whole bunch of different companies of different sizes. And what they found is the main reason that companies are adopting the cloud, or this, I guess the second reason, but one of the main reasons is 41% said they are adding cloud capabilities for disaster recovery. So they're not necessarily moving their application, but their application's disaster recovery plan uses the cloud. Of those surveyed, 35% that said the main reason they're increasing their cloud presence, moving to like SaaS-based offerings, is to provide better resiliency and disaster recovery. And lastly, they asked, why are you moving existing applications to the cloud? And 38% said they are moving their applications primarily because of enhanced disaster recovery. So pretty compelling data around organizations moving something to the cloud to provide better disaster recovery. But what are the benefits that the cloud has that people are going to it? Why are they doing this? So there's a few advantages that I want to go over. And the first is cloud enables you to reduce the amount of time it takes you to recover from an event. So if we think about how long it takes to recover from an event in traditional disaster recovery, you're going to have to spin up a whole bunch of servers. Maybe you're, coming back from tape, and then you have a lot of manual processes. The cloud was born for automation, essentially. It has all these front-end APIs that allow you to automate various workflows and resources to spin up quickly. So you can vastly reduce your recovery time when you're trying to do disaster recovery in the cloud. The other thing that cloud has is it can really reduce the cost of disaster recovery. Now, one of the things that we kept coming back to when we looked at the survey data is spending for DR has been flat over the last 5 or 6 years. People are just not building that into their budget. They're not increasing their spending for that. And so how do you continue to protect all of your critical applications when your budget is basically not going up? Well, if we look at a traditional disaster recovery model, chances are you have some sort of co-location center or a secondary data center where you've got a rack of hardware or multiple racks of hardware, and depending on your production workload and your performance guarantees that you give to your clients and end users, you might have to have duplicate hardware in your disaster recovery site versus your primary site, and that's a pretty expensive capital outlay that you got to give there. There's also the administrative burden of keeping all that hardware, firmware up to date, making sure that all of the hardware is in good condition, maintaining the operating systems that run on it, et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of administrative costs as well as the capital costs that exist in traditional disaster recovery. So how does the cloud help with all of that? Well, the main thing is the cloud provides all of those resources when you need them, but not when you don't. So going with the example of the colo where you have all this standby hardware and OSs, typically you wouldn't do that in a cloud deployment because you can just issue a command. And let's say that my production environment is 100 VMs with multiple subnets and some front public-facing endpoints and whatnot. I can issue a command to an API endpoint in the cloud, asking it to spin up that entire environment. And over the course of the next 10 to 20 minutes, it will spin up that entire environment and get it prepped and running for me. I didn't have to pay for any of that prior to it existing. And when I'm done my disaster recovery test or an actual live disaster recovery, I can destroy all of those resources. Just send a command to the cloud, to whatever the API endpoint is, and say, all right, I'm done. Get rid of all this stuff. And then I stop paying for it. And if you think about the cost there that you've reduced from a capital side, it's huge. But it also reduces your administrative overhead because all of that hardware and software that you've had to patch and keep up to date in your disaster recovery site, now you really don't have to do that. Now, depending on your disaster recovery point and time objectives, you might have to have some live resources running in the cloud at all times, but you probably don't have to have the entire thing set up at once. You could have sort of a dial tone environment that is able to scale up rapidly in response to a disaster event. The other thing that cloud, or the last thing that cloud brings, is the increased chance of success. And there's a couple reasons behind that. So we already talked a little bit about the fact that cloud was built for automation. That's one of the key drivers behind using cloud is the ability to just send programmatic commands to spin up resources and configure them. The fact that you're able to do that through automation means that your deployment will be consistent. And as long as your run books are up to date, now you have a high level of successfully executing on your plan. Your chances of success are also higher because you've reduced your cost. And so you now have more resources to spend on proper training and planning and getting your people ready. And you can set aside more time to do multiple practices. The nice thing about the cloud is if you just want to do a single practice of a single application, you can automate a lot of that. And then, typically most disaster recoveries would be tests. You would go to a facility and sit in that facility for multiple days, and you take the whole team out of commission, which again is very costly, and sit them down in this isolated area and have them go through this DR exercise with very low probability of great success. Now you're able to say, all right, I'm going to do this in the cloud, so I don't have to gather everybody in a specific area. I can carve off just a chunk of what I want to practice recovering. And I can do it in such a way that it's automated, and I can do it multiple times throughout the year, so that when the big bang test comes, if you want to do the full test only once a year, you now have a much increased level of success by utilizing some of the advantages that the cloud brings to it. So just to kind of put a bow on it and come back to those 5 key principles, the number one is that business first. You have to take that business first approach. If you're not finding ways to make sure that the business is up and running, it's very hard to justify the budget for DR and the resources for DR to the people who hold the pen that can sign the check. The second thing is keeping it application centric. You want to make sure that you're recovering from an application centric perspective and not a bottom up perspective where you're like, well, I have, array based replication technology, so my DR plan's all set, right? Now, there's a lot more to that. And so understanding the applications and their dependencies from the top down can make sure that your plan actually makes sense. The third key is just embracing automation. I know automation can be tough, but at the end of the day, in a lot of ways, it's the thing that's going to enable you to consistently and repeatably recover your environment in a way that is successful. And that leads into the next point, which is practice, practice, practice. You can't jump off the couch and run the DR marathon. You really have to find ways to practice small portions of your disaster recovery plan throughout the year, so that even if you're only doing the full shebang once a year, you know that you've got all the different components down really well. And now it's just like a Lego set that you're putting together to get that full picture. And then lastly, leverage the cloud. Leverage the heck out of that thing. Whether or not you're going to put your production workloads in the cloud, that's absolutely not necessary. But using it for disaster recovery, it's kind of a slam dunk. DR and cloud are like peanut butter and jelly, or peanut butter and chocolate, if that's more your flavor. They just mesh so well together. It's the thing that we and the clients that we serve, we've seen a sea change of turning down their existing colos that are doing DR and moving it all to a cloud-based DR solution. And then really the only thing that they're paying for when they're not spinning up resources is the storage that they're consuming in the cloud. And it's a huge change in cost and mindset. Now, I talked a lot about the keys, and of course, this is an Anexinet sponsored webinar, so I do want to talk a little bit about our disaster recovery Kickstart. This is a way to help you adopt these 5 keys and plan out sort of an updated disaster recovery plan and exercise. And just to take you through this, so when it comes to step 1, it's really a review of your current landscape. We need to figure out, where things stand, what level of technology you have, what level of maturity you have with your people and processes, what applications exist, and how they need to be protected. That goes into step 2 of our Kickstart approach, which is doing a maturity assessment and creating a report card from that maturity assessment that says, here's where you stand today. And then based off that report card, let's move into step 3 and create some recommendations. So go through at an enterprise level, here's all the gaps that you might have in your maturity levels and what you would need to do to get to the next level. So let's create the recommendations that you need to execute on, and then develop a roadmap for in what order and how those tasks need to be executed to bring your DR to the next level. And then finally, we select a candidate application with your participation and develop a full-blown disaster recovery plan around that specific candidate application and any of the shared services it requires to run, stuff like DNS and DHCP, fun stuff. We develop that full DR plan, and then we do a tabletop exercise where we actually walk through, just in a tabletop environment, say, okay, disaster declared, who it gets to declare that, okay, and then what's the next step, and just walk through that plan and refine it to the point that you'll be ready to actually execute that plan in a test environment and go through those things. This is a really rapid engagement. It's 2 weeks. It's a little intense. But at the end of it, you get that robust roadmap and a DR plan for a single application, which we think is, pretty useful. And in terms of budget, it's not going to blow your budget out, which I know is, as we said before, that's a common concern around disaster recovery, since budgets aren't exactly increasing. So if you want to know more about disaster recovery and kind of our approach to it, information like that, there's a number of different places you can go. Attached to this webinar is the Disaster Recovery Kickstart brochure. So you can download that file. It's included, let's see what the name of that field is. In the handouts, that's what they call it. It's included in the handouts, so you can go ahead and download that at your leisure. We also have on the Anexinet website, anexinet.com, the Ultimate Disaster Recovery Checklist. And so that is a series of questions that takes you through how robust or ready is your disaster recovery plan, with some feedback and a couple of recommendations around that. And we also have a blog series that we're publishing a blog about once a week on various aspects of disaster recovery, from an organizational level all the way down to, some technical bits and bytes. So we kind of play around in the entire space for that. So that's pretty much the presentation. Before I open it up for questions, I just want to let everyone know that after this webinar, you will be sent a survey. If you fill out that survey, and I hope you do, you will get a $10 Starbucks gift card. So now I'd like to open it up to questions. Let me check the question bank and see if anybody's dropped one in yet. Okay, I do have one question, and it is, my current disaster recovery plan is, well, it's pretty manual. Where do I start with automation? That's a good question, because when you look at automation, it can seem pretty darn overwhelming. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of places you could start. It's a bit like eating an elephant. And you know the old joke, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so our recommendation is, you're not going to automate everything right out of the box. It's best to carve off some chunks of what makes sense to automate and some easy wins so you can gain confidence with it. And then once you get that ball rolling, you'll find that the bigger automation challenges become smaller just because you're kind of chipping away at them. See if we have any. Okay, I've got one more. How do you go about selecting an application to start with disaster recovery? So that's a good question. It can be difficult to decide. Generally speaking, we recommend that you start with an application that is business critical, because that's where you're going to show the most value back to the business, right? Business first, application centric. That sort of covers those two bases. But you also have to bear in mind the complexity level of that business critical application. So if you have 3 or 4 applications that are possible candidates, I would go with not the most complicated one, but one that you can certainly show the value, but it's not going to be such a heavy lift. It goes back to the eating an elephant kind of thing. What other questions we have? Right. You didn't talk about technology a whole lot in the presentation. Do you have any recommendations? That is an interesting topic, and you're right. I did not talk about technology. There are a ton of technology solutions out there, but in our experience, generally speaking, tech is relatively simple when you compare it to getting people and processes worked out. So we tend to focus in our disaster recovery engagements and strategy more around the people and process. It's in the vendor's best interest to make disaster recovery solutions as painless as possible. And we do have a number of partners that we work with, but we understand that different organizations have different technical requirements. So part of any strategy is to figure out what those requirements are and then find a product that fits those requirements, as opposed to buying a product and trying to fit your business to match what the product can do. Let's see. Do you have any other questions? I already have a secondary data center. Why would I use the cloud? That I like that one, and I'm going to be frank. The answer is you might not. The main drivers, for me around the cloud are automation and cost reduction. So if you already have really great automation in your secondary data center and a bunch of sunk costs in hardware, that's cool. I mean, roll with that. There's no reason for you to embrace the cloud for the sake of embracing the cloud. But it would be good to look at what your administrative overhead is in maintaining and managing that secondary data center. Last question. I think this is the last question we're going to do, but I like this. This is a good one. What about cloud native applications? How do I plan for DR with something like that? So for those who aren't familiar with cloud native, we're generally speaking about microservices type applications. Maybe they use containers or serverless functions as a service, something like that. But generally speaking, the question is really like, how do you do disaster recovery for that? And I guess that would just lead to a lot more questions from me, probably more than we have time for. But just a couple quick ones is, are you using your cloud native deployment in public cloud, and is it using a bunch of platform as a service in that public cloud? Because then you really have to design your DR to take advantage of those platforms as a service. You're probably not going to do a traditional DR for that. I guess another one would be, where does your data reside? I mean, any application is going to have stateful data somewhere. And ultimately, you're going to want to figure out where that data resides, how you need to replicate it, is it sharded, all those types of things to kind of figure out what disaster recovery looks like from the data side of things. And if it's microservices, there might be a pretty good chance that it's already easy to globally distribute. So it's really just replicating that stateful layer. And then the last thing I would say about that is that to give a consulting answer, I mean, it ultimately really depends on the application. So if you have a question about that, I would love to talk more about that one-on-one, what your application looks like and how we could help you develop a DR plan to tailored to that application. All right. I believe that is all the time we have and all the questions we have. So again, I just want to thank everybody for taking some time out of your day to listen to me talk about disaster recovery and what the 5 keys are. Again, you're going to get a survey after this webinar. Please, fill out the survey. I love to hear feedback. Great. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.